So, let me welcome today's speaker, Tom Beeks, a trainer at the Bell Foundation. Many of you will already know Tom, but for those who don't, Tom has worked in English language education since 2003. He's taught around the world and is particularly interested in international education and teacher development. Tom helped create the Bell Foundation's Language for Results International suite of online training courses, and he also works as an assessor for the Bell Foundation's ALFRE accreditation programme. Today's webinar is the first of two webinars in which Tom will explore how the Bell Foundation's updated Classroom Guidance and Strategies document can be used in an international school context. If there's time at the end, Tom will take any questions that you may have. Feel free to use the Q&A option that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen to send any questions as they come to you, and I'll collect them and pose them to Tom at the end. Over the next couple of days, you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording of the webinar and the links to the resources that are mentioned during the webinar today. And now I'll hand you over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for such a lovely introduction, and welcome everyone. As Caroline mentioned, please do feel free to use the chat box as we go if you want to post any comments or links or anything like that, and you can use the Q&A box as well for any questions that you might have, and we'll try and get to them at the end. So yeah, it's great to see people joining us from so many different places. Here's an overview of what we're going to do today in this session. So our overall aim is basically just to give you a bit more familiarity with our new support strategies, and to give you some practical ideas and guidance on how they might be used with specific reference to an international context. So we'll start with a brief description of what the strategy documents are and why we've made them. We'll look at who might find them useful to use, and we'll look at how they are structured to help practitioners. And I'm going to finish with three kind of illustrative case studies that might show how three fictional teachers might use the document to include EAL learners in their classes. So let's get started. I'm going to give you a quick overview, first of all, of what the strategies document is and why we updated them. And I thought I'd start with this quote from Evans et al., which encapsulates why there is a need for such a document. And as you can see here, it talks about the importance of identifying and using strategies to engage and bring EAL students into the sort of center stage of learning. The aim really is we want to help teachers make their lessons more inclusive for EAL learners through being able to provide suitable strategies which we know work. In our partner webinar next week, we'll explore in more detail what kinds of effective CPD for EAL might look like and how the strategies could help with that. But for now, it's enough to acknowledge the importance of ensuring that teaching staff know about and can use these effective strategies. So what have we produced? Well, after lots of research and discussion and drafting and redrafting, this is what we created, this document. And it's full of guidance, ideas and suggestions for strategies which will help to include learners using EAL within mainstream curriculum classes, whatever their proficiency in English. So it's a bit of a one-stop shop really for EAL guidance, and it's really designed as a starting point, if you like, towards developing inclusive EAL provision, especially in situations where perhaps there isn't much information or expertise otherwise available. And documents are free to download and printable, and they contain links to relevant resources, web pages and research. If you've been following the Bell Foundation for a while, you might be aware of our previous strategies document, which these replace. And the new document basically builds on and improves these, taking into account some of the feedback that we've heard from teachers using the document themselves. So you'll find that a lot of the original guidance has been retained, but it's just been reorganized to make it more user-friendly. There are useful working links. So they've all been updated to make sure the links that go to anything external actually work. And we're signposting any relevant research and resources. There's also a glossary of key terms, and we use the Bell Foundation key principles to frame all the advice, and I'll speak more to that later in the presentation. We've also tried to take into account any new research that's relevant as well, and signpost that, because it's important, we believe, that any practical action is informed by evidence and research. So let's look at who might find these strategy documents useful. And I think it's fair to say that the guidance is primarily intended for classroom and subject teachers who have or expect to have learners using English as an additional language in their classes. However, the ideas and suggestions are also going to be of interest to EAL specialists, EAL teachers, or EAL coordinators, and of course, those in a leadership role who are seeking to advise teachers on how best to include learners who use EAL. They could also be of interest to support staff, such as teaching assistants, and indeed for anyone running EAL interventions or withdrawal groups, which is pretty common practice in international schools, much more so perhaps than in the UK. And certainly these strategies can be applied alongside the mainstream curriculum provision in those kind of sessions, but they are focused generally on in-class support, because that's the most likely form of support we have in the UK, and the document was originally devised for a UK audience, which is why that focus is there. But keep an eye out, because we are producing a further guidance document on how you can apply the guidance to intervention or withdrawal classes early next year. And I think lastly, it may also be pointed out that the strategies could be a resource for parents of children using EAL to help them understand ways in which to support what is happening in class. And obviously, especially if they themselves are able to read in English, which many parents of children in an international school context do, of course. But you'll notice there is a question mark there, and I think that's because, the document is aimed at education professionals, and it may need some mediation if we want to share it with people who are outside of an education role. But certainly, I think it might form a useful basis for a source of information that you then give to parents. Okay, so one of the biggest changes that we've made to the support strategies document compared to the previous versions is in how we've organized the information. So I'm going to look at that next, and then I'll talk about how the way it's organized might help school staff better support your learners using EAL as we go along. So the most simple way we've organized the strategies is that it's separated into a primary and a secondary phase document. And each document includes age-appropriate examples from different ages. And the guidance for primary and secondary are available separately, but that isn't to say that you may want to refer to both of them together, especially if you are working at the top end of primary or the lower end of secondary, because many of the strategies will be appropriate across phases. So don't feel that you have to limit yourself to one of the documents. The guidance is organised according to the 5 assessment bands following the Bell Foundation EAL assessment framework for schools. Some of you may well be familiar with that and already use it. For those of you who aren't, this is a framework that we've created that was based on the UK government proficiency bands and descriptors for learners using EAL. If you want to find out more, please go to our website. So I'm assuming most of you probably have some idea of what these bands are, and I will be referring to them throughout, and the summary is on the screen. But as we know, learners do not always fit neatly into one band, and neither do activities and strategies. So although we've organized the strategies by band, you might find it useful to read the suggestions for the bands below and above the band at which your learner is currently working. And obviously, some of the suggestions are going to be relevant for more than one band. But we don't want to have too much repetition, so we've tried to avoid repeating too many of the strategies. So look across the bands and use your judgment. And of course, in many classes, you're going to be working with learners who are working at different proficiency bands as well. So again, it's just important to it's a question of reading around the different strategies and then choosing the strategies that are going to work best for your students and your context. Those of you who do use the Bell Foundation assessment framework, you might be aware that we have a tracker document as well, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet which allows you to input and track student assessment data, and that is linked to the old strategy. So if you allocate a learner to be band C, it will link that directly to relevant strategies. And now we haven't yet aligned the tracker with the new strategy document yet, but we're hoping to do that next year. So again, keep your eyes peeled for that. You'll see that if you look at the document that it's being color coded to correspond to the different bands. So that's fairly self-explanatory. So you can see in the example here, the orange refers to band D. And lastly, we've also divided at each band the strategies into different domains of language use, that different skills that learners need. So we've got one section at each band for reading and viewing and writing, and we've got another section for speaking and listening. You can see there with clear icons to sort of represent those for quick navigation. And again, those of us that work with EAL learners regularly, we know that there's an overlap between all these skills. They don't really work discreetly. So, we know that a good reading and writing activity will also involve an element of teacher explanation and class or group prediction, planning, discussion, and that involves oracy work. So although we have divided it into kind of literacy activities with reading and writing and oracy activities with speaking and listening, they're often intertwined. So it's, again, going to be helpful to kind of read the document as a whole, so that you don't miss ideas, really. And I guess the most sort of salient difference between this new version and the previous one is that we've organized the strategies according to 5 key principles, and these are the 5 key Bell Foundation principles that we use across all of our materials creation and our work, essentially. And the idea really is just to make our materials and guidance a bit more coherent, and in turn to guide schools towards offering a more kind of holistic approach, I guess, to EL provision, rather than just cherry picking the odd thing here and there. We know that the most effective approaches are kind of joined up. So I'll take a moment just to talk through each of these principles and how they relate to the guidance, and you'll see what I mean. So our first principle, they each have a little logo. This one is multilingualism as an asset. And you'll know that there's plenty of research that shows the crucial role a learner's home language plays in their sense of identity and well-being, as well, of course, as having benefits in developing greater cognitive flexibility and stronger academic performance. And so the guidance in this section are really included to help enable and promote multilingualism in your classrooms and to develop that kind of thriving ethos that really embraces multilingualism and the use of different languages, which is something actually I think a lot of international schools do really well. At least they're very good at talking about it. And then I think hopefully these strategies might sort of give you more concrete ideas of what that might actually look like. Our second principle then is the need to set high expectations for our plurilingual students whilst still providing the necessary support. And in this section, you can find guidance to help you avoid the temptation to dumb down or simplify the curriculum for EAL learners and instead to amplify it through judicious use of scaffolding, for example. And it's really important, I think, to send this message to teaching staff that the cognitive and academic abilities of learners using EAL are separate from their current ability to use English. And like all learners, those using EAL are going to benefit from being motivated and challenged in the classroom. Yeah, so this looks at ways that can be achieved through scaffolding the language, but still keeping that cognitive challenge in terms of the curriculum. And the third principle then is this importance of combining and integrating language and content together. So the strategies here take into account the double job which learners using EAL are faced with, which is learning a new language and then learning a subject alongside that, whether that's maths, geography, science, literature, or whatever. And the guidance and suggestions in this section can be used to help plan and teach lessons and to help especially subject teachers or classroom teachers integrate language learning into their subject content to enable learners to achieve this dual goal that they have. So this could be applied in kind of mainstream classroom setting, where it's often the case that we need to sort of layer in the language support alongside the curricular content. Or if you work in a setting that has specialist EAL lessons, it might speak to the need to do the reverse, which is to bring in relevant curricular content into those language-focused sessions to ensure that what's being taught is going to support whatever is going on in the curricular classes and isn't being treated like an independent process and a separate responsibility. Our fourth principle then is the use of effective and holistic assessment. And basically, these are strategies that are going to help you conduct suitable EAL assessments. Again, the key message overall is that in order to be effective, assessment needs to be relevant and tailored for the learner that we're trying to assess. And as I'm sure you know, it's a constant battle that staff in international schools have. I know it's hard often to find assessment tasks that are tailored for learners using EAL. Many of the formal standardized tests, things that are designed to assess reading age, verbal reasoning, and so on, reading comprehension in English, are designed for pupils for whom English is their first language. And therefore, they're of limited use for learners using EAL because on their own, they can't give an accurate picture of what that learner can do and their progress. So the guidance here are kind of looking at suggestions of how you might supplement or adapt the assessment process to give you that fuller picture. It doesn't have all the answers, unfortunately. I know everyone's always crying out for a sort of perfect assessment tool for our EAL learners, but I don't think such a thing exists yet. Please let me know if I'm wrong or if you know of one. Lastly then, but certainly last but not least, we have the final principle, which is social inclusion. And these strategies in this section speak to the need that learners using EAL, including new arrivals and including those at the earlier stages of English language acquisition, need to be able to look around them and feel that, yes, this is a school where they can learn and thrive and be themselves. So, it's speaking to that need that learners using EAL need to feel safe and secure and have a sense of belonging to their school, and through that to the wider community in order to maximize their opportunities for success. Of course, this is particularly important for children who may have been displaced due to things like conflict or political instability, which is sadly becoming kind of more, I think, salient around the world currently. But in any international school setting, as we know, there's going to be diverse multilingual groups, and it is going to be important to consider the social inclusion needs of all of those children. Even in settings where all or nearly all the learners share a first language or share the local culture, then there's going to be work to be done around ensuring that they feel their home language and culture are respected and valued and included in the school, and in learning in positive ways that kind of encourage that sense of pride and belonging, in both their kind of home culture and the other cultures that they're learning about in an international education setting. If you're interested in finding out more about our wonderful principles, and why wouldn't you, then literally yesterday, I think we published a couple of posters that are free to download from our website, which you can see on the screen in front of you there. So if that's something that's of interest to you, you can go on the website and download those. But I think, I'm a big fan of kind of overarching principles that can organize how we do things. And I think this could be a good starting point if you're interested in developing EAL provision in your setting. Okay, back to our principles then. So how does this actually look? We have our 5 principles. What does this look like on the page? Well, you'll see that for each band, it's divided up into the 5 sections. And so these principles are revisited throughout each band. And you can see here an example from band A with suggestions for activities which reinforce the multilingualism is an asset principle. So, for example, it's suggesting things like first language mentoring or first language buddies for band A learners in the classroom. And if we move over to band D for the same principle, you can see that the learner has progressed, and we're looking at strategies that are things like reflecting on and talking about the differences and similarities between English and other languages that they know. And you'll see this sense of progression running through all the sections. So as a sort of summary then, each section contains suggestions of activities to use with your learners, such as this one here about planning for language structures needed for a task. However, we've also, at the end of each section of suggestions, you'll see a table like the one you can see on the left of your screen, or right of your screen, sorry, the blue table. And this is an example of what it might look like in practice. Okay, so it's essentially a little sort of case study. And the examples show in table form the types of activities the teacher, the class, and the learner using EAL might undertake during a lesson, incorporating some of these strategies. And each of these little examples comes from a different subject area and different topic material taken from the sort of English national curriculum. and it's just there to really give that kind of link between the sort of theory and the strategy and practice, which is often missing. And this is based on feedback we were getting from teachers who were using our strategies previously. So I think it's important to say that these little snapshots are not lesson plans at all, but they are just kind of they're examples basically of the sort of worked examples of these strategies, there to bridge that gap between the kind of abstract strategy and theory and the concrete and often messy realities of using these strategies in the classroom. And we're going to look a bit more at some examples later in the presentation. The last thing I want to draw your attention to then in terms of how the document is organized is at the end, you'll see there's now a handy glossary of key terms, and these have hyperlinks throughout the document, which link to the glossary. And again, the hope here is that it just becomes more accessible to all staff members, especially those that aren't language teachers or EAL specialists and who may not be familiar with all of the jargon and the kind of terms that get used. And so, yeah, I think that's quite a useful resource as well. Okay, so that's how, that's the sort of how and the why and the what of the strategies. But I want now to sort of look more closely at the practical realities of, well, how can this help us in the classroom, basically. So I want to look at how we're using the strategies in class to help individual learners or groups of learners. And there are different ways in which it might be useful. So in terms of when and where you could use it, you might want to use it, for example, alongside our assessment framework, if you're using that. Obviously, that can help you design suitable classroom activities for learners according to the proficiency level that you've assessed them at. And it's also going to help you with the tracking of progress and setting targets and so on. I mean, essentially, when you ascertain a proficiency in English band for your learner, you'll be able to consult the document for advice on suitable strategies. I think obviously one of the most obvious applications is to suggest teaching ideas and examples which you can adapt to suit your context. And again, we've had, as I've mentioned earlier, there's links and signposts to other resources which will provide further detail, because we didn't want to make the document the size of a phone book or encyclopedia. So there's lots of links and signposts rather than going into a lot of depth. And we recommend visiting our great ideas pages on the website, for example, for more information on the detail around some of the strategies and approaches mentioned. The guidance also includes suggestions that may help with the organisation of EAL provision and the deployment of staff. So we're talking about things like, ideas for seating or grouping, how to deploy support staff, ways of encouraging and promoting the use of languages that are known by learners, and so on. So this could also help guide that kind of organisation. And it might also provide a sort of EAL-friendly lens through which to help consider purchasing decisions when you're buying or creating curriculum resources for use in the classroom. So you might want to think, for example, whether the key principles are being adhered to, and whether there is space in the scheme of work that you're using for valuing languages and bringing in using students' home languages, and is it integrating language with subject content effectively, and things like that as well. And lastly, and I think this is really the main audience that we see for the strategies document, but it's supporting those teachers who are new to working with plurilingual learners, um, either because they have not worked with them before, perhaps they are being recruited in from a context where they didn't have to work with plurilingual learners, and it's a new concept for them. Or it might be that they're coming from a perhaps a local context where they are very experienced teachers, but they've only been working in a monolingual situation in their own country, and then now working in a bilingual or a multilingual context, and they may not be familiar with some of the pedagogies and the strategies that and the adaptations that are needed. Okay, so what does this look like in practice? And to illustrate all of this and how it can play out in the real world, I've put together a couple of case studies that involve kind of practical and actionable examples from the strategies, just to sort of see how it might fit together. These are entirely made up and kind of based on, a combination of personal experience and experience of colleagues, and the kinds of challenges that we see teachers facing in multilingual classrooms. So our first example, which comes from a primary setting, I would like to introduce you to Amisha. So this is Amisha, and she's a Bahasa Indonesian speaker from Indonesia, of course. And she joined an English medium international school in Jakarta in the final months of kindergarten in the last school year. Her English proficiency is band A, and which is new to English. So band A is, new to English. And she had no prior exposure to English before joining the school in kindergarten. So she's already made a couple of friends at the school, but she's quite shy. And now she's started in year one. Her language is beginning to develop. Amisha is full of curiosity. She likes books and she loves animals, and she's always trying to take them home. So she's in luck because this term they're kicking off with the topic of mini beasts. Now, the teacher has a look at the guidance and the support strategies for Band A learners, and she finds these suggestions. First suggestion is planning to make sure the learner has a grip on the key vocabulary and structures to participate in the lesson. The teacher notices the importance of nurturing opportunities to speak in non-threatening situations and of being able to use the home language. And so having those opportunities and to sort of feel comfortable communicating, whether in English or home language. And very important always, but obviously especially for new to English and younger learners, the use of visuals to support the learning. So in this example then, the teacher starts the topic by showing pictures and naming the different mini beasts. There's a whole range of different mini beasts, kind of culturally appropriate to the local setting. So that they might have taken out a couple of ones from the book which were more aimed at a sort of European audience, and they've inserted some of the ones that children are more likely to find in Indonesia. And the teacher wants to keep expectations high, so she has all the learners together, and she's encouraging all the children to join in the naming activity to the extent that they can. And so this is really good vocabulary building for the whole class. Some of the children know all the names already and have names for the body parts and things like that. Some of the children are still learning and so have different gaps. And so by doing this activity as a joint thing, the children are hearing different models of language, and they're being exposed to new language as well. And the teacher is making sure she's using, repeating the same kind of structures. So you can see here things like this is a and it has got. So we're keeping very simple structures, but they're being repeated and the children have got lots of opportunities to repeat. So following this, then the teacher puts the children into small groups around their tables, and each group is given a picture of a particular mini beast. Um, Amisha is grouped with Sonia, who's a very friendly girl who speaks good English. And in pairs, they talk about the butterfly and have to think of as many words as they can to describe it. In this discussion, Amisha makes some suggestions in Bahasa, which Sonia is then able to kind of translate into English. And as part of a snowballing activity, they then compare their ideas with the other pair on the table, and they end up talking all together in English. After this snowboarding activity, then they're going to move around the room in their pairs, showing their picture to other children and describing it. So as they move around the room, Sonia, for example, says, "This is a butterfly. It is black and it's got white and blue spots." And the other pair they're talking to tell them all about their snail and how it has a stripy shell. Amisha wants to take part and she's getting involved and she manages butterfly spots. That's where she is. And this is noticed and praised by the nearby teaching assistant. So next, the teacher has she's had a look at the reading and writing suggestions, and she notices the importance of grouping and peer modeling. The importance of matching writing and meaning. And so having the opportunity to recognize the written form of the word and associating that with its meaning. And also making those connections with home so that learning can be reinforced by parents or carers and they can be included. So after the snowballing activity that we just saw and the sort of sharing activity, after this activity, the children sit in their groups to record what they have learned and make a little booklet about the different mini beasts. So at this point, Misha's group includes some other speakers of Bahasa, as well as her partner Sonia. And so Amisha and some of the other children swap some words in Bahasa while they're drawing their mini beasts. And Amisha is able to copy the word for butterfly under her picture. And she labels some of the body parts with help from the other girls in her group as well. Then they each make a small booklet on mini beasts with drawings and labels that they can take home. And obviously the amount of language that's involved in the booklets varies quite a lot according to the child, but they've all managed to create something with the kind of using the language that they're able to use. And as a final activity, then the class then plays a matching pairs game. And this particular game, you can see there's a link, is based on one of the Bell Foundation resources. And so this activity gives Amisha lots of opportunities to repeat and use all the new vocabulary she's picked up during the lesson, as well as to hear other children modeling perhaps some of the more sophisticated language around the topic according to their different proficiency levels. So by the end of this lesson sequence then, Amisha has finished the day. She's made some new friends in her group. She's learned some mini beast words and she's really proud of her beautiful butterfly picture and a little booklet. And at home, she's going to tell all her parents about it. And she shows them the picture book and she can talk to them about it in her home language, as well as, use some English, the English vocabulary that she's learned as well. So hopefully this is kind of, she's successfully developing her bilingualism and she's moving in the right direction. So there's an example from a primary setting. Let's look at example 2. So I'd like to introduce you to Huang Xin. He comes from China, so his first language is Mandarin Chinese. and he's recently joined a small international school in the Netherlands. His parents have moved over for work purposes. So he arrived in the middle of year 9, and he's just entered year 10. And he's generally perceived to be very bright, but his proficiency in English is currently at band C, sort of developing competence, and that's holding him back a little bit from achieving in the IGCSE studies that are taking place at the school. So Huang Xin has settled in quite well, but recently he is becoming somewhat frustrated because he was a really good student in his previous school back in China, and he feels that here he cannot show his full ability. He really wants to do well on his exams, particularly in his favorite subjects, which are physics and chemistry, but he's not a huge fan of writing, which sometimes holds him back in the more language-heavy subjects. He's operating in band C, so he does have a sort of solid grasp of kind of English basics, and he's starting to understand and get much better at understanding what's going on around him, but he does struggle still to join in really fast moving or wide ranging conversations, and that also can be a source of frustration. Huang Xin loves cars and motorsport, and he wants to be a mechanic or an engineer, preferably for a Formula One team. And this term in science, the topic is cells. And it's the topic is sorry, the subject is biology, and the teacher's trying to prepare the students for the longer 5 or 6 mark questions which appear in the IGCSE exams, and they require students to write a short text. So again, the teacher consults the strategy document, but also the subject-specific guidance for teaching EAL learners in science from the Bell Foundation website. And again, they sort of note down some of the key ideas and suggestions. First of which is the importance of exploring and activating any prior knowledge. Hopefully we know from experience that EAL learners are never blank slates, and especially obviously at secondary level, it's a good chance they're already in possession of a lot of subject knowledge, which may not be, that knowledge may not be in English. Secondly, the science textbook, although it's a good one, the book they're using is very dense, it's very wordy, it's quite academic, and it's quite daunting to someone with limited English. So it's going to be really important to reduce the cognitive load to help avoid overwhelm by concentrating on some of the key concepts and the language used to express those. And I expect many of you may have heard of the teaching learning cycle. But the idea here is that as a teacher, you build the field with key vocabulary, the structures and concepts the student needs, as well as activating any prior knowledge the students have and bringing that in as well. You then might look at a model text, for example. In this case, the teacher might want to provide model answers to the GCSE exam questions the students are going to take and analyze them. So, things like how many sentences, how many scientific points do you need to make? How is the text answering the command words that are used? So, how are they, how does the text explain, describe, evaluate, and so on? And then with this model, you examine, you analyze the model, and then you co-construct a text as a group with the class, led by the teacher, to create a good example before the individuals have their own go at constructing a text. So within this framework then, we need to activate the prior knowledge. So Huang Xin was fully educated in China to an age-appropriate level before he came to the school. And the teacher wants to find out what he might already know. Unfortunately, there is no Chinese-speaking member of staff available. So they're using some picture prompts and a translation tool. And he ascertains that Huang Xin has indeed studied the topic previously. It's hard to tell in how much detail or how effectively, but it it's clear that the concepts are not entirely new to him, and therefore translation tools will be useful to help Huangxin transfer his knowledge to English. So Huangxin then is given some pre-class work of labeling pictures of different cell types with the Chinese and English names, and he brings this to the lesson to use as a kind of reference sheet. The teacher also wants to skill Huangxin up with the language and structures that he needs to succeed. So he reduces the cognitive load required by using a substitution table. And this enables Huangxin to jointly practice identifying cell types and their functions and using sentence structures. And activities like this could be done with the whole class, or it might be something just to give Huangxin separately to help him while the class answers questions from the textbook. But by providing that scaffolding, he's able to respond to questions that otherwise he might not yet be able to. And then finally, following the teaching and learning cycle that we just talked about, the teacher examines the model text. So they look at the example 6-point exam question model and the model answers, and they look at how they're constructed, and how they respond to different command words, and how do you put the point scoring sort of scientific knowledge that you need to get marks into a coherent English sentence, and how do you kind of connect those sentences together. So they're sort of looking at that. And so to summarize, they're sort of building what you call building the field by collecting the knowledge and summarizing that, modeling the text needed, building those texts together jointly with guidance, and then having a go at doing it on their own. So for the final stage then, the students have a go at working together in small groups to build up an exam answer. They can be done first with the teacher, then in pairs or groups. And then this is revisited before the students attempt to construct their individual texts. For learners such as Huangxin, they're still going to benefit from some extra scaffolding at this stage. But the scaffolding needs to be gradually reduced as the learner increases in confidence before the exam. So the teacher might start the year by giving Huangxin some quite substantial scaffolding, for example, a close exercise of a sample answer like that with missing words for the student to complete. But the teacher knows that he's going to have to progress to being able to work from something like this to be able to create sentences from scratch. So that scaffolding will get reduced gradually across the term and across the year. So you might progress from a gap fill to just using sentence stems to just using a few word prompts, and eventually he'd be able to make his own notes before attempting a question. So effectively, you're teaching them to write their own scaffold by doing that. So the teacher also looks at the speaking and listening at Band C for suggestions to develop that. And they notice things like the importance of allowing thinking time so that learners can construct answers in English in their head. Thinking time is important for all students, but for EAL students, even more so. They also looked at the use of questions and the moving from closed questions to more open questions as the learner develops their English. And lastly, they look at the creating opportunities for structured talk through using graphic organizers to help organize and structure those ideas. So thinking about questioning techniques, then the teacher thinks about how they might adapt what they're doing. So when cold calling in the lesson, the teacher makes sure he gives Huangxin a warning so that he has time to marshal his thoughts in English. He starts by asking closed questions, for example, giving a choice of answers as Huangxin builds confidence. And as it gets more confident, the teacher starts to ask more open questions. The teacher brings in a graphic organizer. So Huangxin works together in a group of friendly peers who, again, have probably higher proficiency in English generally, and they work together to try and complete this graphic organizer. And this particular group of students are quite competitive, so the teacher adds in a sort of competitive element to this activity to see who can complete the table correctly first. Huangxin loves this kind of activity. He's very competitive. He's got a very good vocabulary, and he's also using his translation app. And he already has a lot of the subject knowledge. It's just maybe the vocabulary that's letting him down. But he's getting really involved with this activity, and this is giving him practice in meaningful subject-specific dialogue within a small group. There's lots of kind of checking of understanding, of asking questions, of asking people to rephrase and things like that, to sort of negotiate meaning around terms and things like that. And the teacher's able to monitor the groups and kind of see how much knowledge is being retained and where there might be gaps. And Huangxin, along with his classmates, are getting the opportunity to rehearse and practice speaking a lot of the key scientific vocabulary, with the occasional recourse to his translation app or bilingual glossary. And at the end of that activity, the answers are revealed. There's lots of cheering and groans as students recognize their mistakes and correct them and rub out and add them in. So the lesson ends on that note, and we can see then that during that lesson, Huangxin has finished the lesson feeling that he's learned some important new vocabulary. He's been able to prove some of what he already knows, and he gets some recognition as well, both from his peers and from his teachers. He's been able to speak some English with his peers. And crucially, perhaps, these exams that everyone's talking about and that are coming up on the horizon, he feels like he can actually achieve in those two. And certainly his teacher has noticed and is feeling a lot happier as well about his participation in the exams that are coming up. All right, so there's Huangxin. And then just for the last 5 minutes, I'll give you one final example. And this example I've chosen deliberately to kind of showcase how we might support learner even at the higher band of proficiency. So, it's really important, I think, that we don't think of EAL support as just existing purely for those at the lower bands and new to English learners, even though clearly they are the people that need greater support. But it should continue all the way. And so here's an example of what that might look like. And this is Gabriela. She's 17. She's originally from Brazil, but she's been living overseas since she was 10. Her home language is Portuguese. But as a talented linguist, she has learned and become pretty fluent in Spanish and French as well during her school career. She's about to complete the final year of her IB diploma at a very multilingual international school in the UAE. Gabriela is a born communicator, and her spoken English and her reading skills are extremely strong. However, she does still struggle sometimes with her academic writing, and she is quite nervous about the extended essay that she's going to have to complete to achieve her IB diploma. And she's one of those students that loves communicating, but she tends to default to writing as she speaks in an academic context, and so she often produces texts which can sound overly informal and maybe lacking in variety. She loves languages and politics, and she wants to study international relations at university. She's heavily involved in the Model UN Club at the school and acts as a student ambassador. She tells everyone who will listen that she's going to become the Secretary General of the UN. And who could doubt her, to be honest? So anyway, this year she is studying in English literature A Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So her English literature teacher, is looking for ways to support Gabriela with her academic writing in particular. So she looks at the reading and writing, and she sees suggestions like continuing to develop a learner's breadth and depth of vocabulary and exploring nuances of meaning, helping learners to develop greater independence in the editing process, and being able to review, I guess, and self-edit and having that kind of meta-linguistic knowledge of where they need to adapt their writing. And also the importance of continuing to involve parents at home and to ensure learners are using their home languages and bringing those in as well to develop develop those alongside the English too. And firstly, then the teacher, as a way of addressing the breadth and depth of vocabulary, she notices that Gabriella has quite a sort of should we say innovative approach to using jargon and vocabulary, because she often gets confused between the different forms that she needs to use. So this is not a lack of understanding. She understands the concepts, but when she's writing it down, she often uses sort of incorrect grammar and things like that, which can make her academic writing harder to read. So the teacher provides a table with the different forms, and that's there as a reference, and it's something that Gabriella can refer to. The teacher also gives her a sort of adapted checklist to help her with her essay writing. So for this task, the English teacher has sort of worked with the EAL coordinator in the school, and they've introduced some specific linguistic criteria for the Band D or E students to go along with the general success criteria they're using for all the learners. So they're including things like avoiding repetition, checking for sort of use of kind of vague words and replacing those with more defined synonyms, and checking they've used the correct form of any technical vocabulary, which, as we saw in the previous example, was a particular problem that Gabriella has. And lastly, the teacher knows that Gabriella speaks really good Spanish. So she finds Gabriella, with the help of the Spanish teacher, an original Spanish language version of the book. And Gabriella's been reading that quite happily at home as well. The parents have been sent the book list for the year with the suggested topics and questions. So her father has been discussing the book with her in Portuguese at home. And finally, the teacher has asked Gabriella specifically to look at examples of where the Spanish and English texts differ, especially in their use of the kind of literary devices they've been studying. Again, this is tailored. Gabriella herself is someone who's very interested in languages, and this is something that for her is quite interesting to do. And then that's something that she can share with the teacher later, and is a way of kind of engaging her really and getting her to read more widely. So we can see at the end of all that, Gabriella has become more accurate in her use of terminology. She's practiced reviewing and refining her written work. There's greater awareness of how written Spanish and English are similar. Spanish is very similar to Portuguese, often in writing as well. So her home language skills there are being brought in, but her Spanish knowledge too. And she's become more confident expressing herself in formal writing contexts. Okay, we're almost finished. I think I'm running a bit late on time. Sorry about that. But just to summarize then, almost all the strategies used in the document are applicable, I think, for in any context, but you may want to mediate some aspects for an international audience. And that's thing like, you might want to signpost strategies that work well with large groups, because in international settings, it's more likely that everybody in the class perhaps is using EAL rather than just one or two individuals. There are some strategies that will work better for groups and that share a first language, and there are some strategies that might work better in a multilingual group. So again, that's something to bear in mind and kind of identify which ones are going to work best for your context. Again, the curriculum mentioned in our document is the UK English is the English curriculum, because it's designed for English schools firstly, as a UK-based charity. But of course, that doesn't mean to say you can't easily adapt those for other curricula as well. You might want to think about how it's used in collaboration with EAL specialists and subject and class teachers. How can they work together to make the most of the strategies document? And Also, will there need to be any cultural mediation? Are all the strategies appropriate for the educational culture in your setting? Are there some kind of activities that are going to work better, or some kinds of activities that need to be adapted? I'll leave you with this quote, um, again from the same text we referenced at the beginning. Teachers who work to achieve an inclusive space in their classrooms and who proactively develop an inclusive pedagogy are a fundamental human resource, making a difference as to how well pupils are integrated or not into classrooms. So I hope these ideas and suggestions will help teachers and educators to create those inclusive spaces in their classrooms and enable our learners using EAL to thrive and learn. Okay. I don't know if we have time for questions, Caroline. I maybe have overrun a bit, but
It's absolutely grand, Tom. It was a great presentation. We haven't actually had any questions, which I'm taking as an
yeah.
indication of how clear you were. Uh,
Okay. Well,
um, I wonder
everyone's gone
though,
to sleep.
if you'd just like to give everybody a quick reminder about the webinar that's coming up next week. I know Lizzie's
Yeah.
already shared the link.
Yeah, so next week we have a partner webinar to this one, which is focusing specifically on CPD, on how to help train practitioners in your setting to be to use more effective strategies with their EAL learners, basically. And it's going to be this one was obviously focused on how the strategies look. This one's going to be more focused on CPD, and the strategies are only going to come in kind of incidentally as a sort of framework for that. So yeah, if you are involved in EAL CPD in your school, or you're a school leader, or you're just a teacher who wants to find out more about how you might support your colleagues with using EAL strategies, then please join us for that.
That's
Um,
great. Thank you, Tom. I have just shared the link so you can find any information about courses and webinars from there, and also sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already done so. And then just a quick reminder, I'm sure you all already know, you'll get an email within 48 hours with a link to the video recording of the webinar and the links that have been shared in the webinar. And you'll get a post-course evaluation now as we leave the webinar. So it'd be absolutely fabulous if you could complete that, please, just to inform our development. And thank you very, very much again. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks for
Thanks a
joining
lot.
us.